I'm going to start today telling a story about a woman named Hannah. Hannah was an Israelite woman. She was loved and she was treated well by her husband. But Hannah had a problem. She couldn't have children, which was a big deal in the Israelite world, especially for women, because that was where they drew a lot of their purpose. And this was an extremely distressing situation for her, because she was not the only wife of her husband. Back in those days, a man could it wasn't prohibited for a man to marry multiple women. It's prohibited within our society, but it certainly caused problems within Israelite society, which we see in many of the stories in the Bible. And this other wife was really not very nice to Hannah. She's actually called out in Scripture as an adversary. And she provoked her so much that it actually says that Hannah wept because of this provoking. Anyways, the family went to Shiloh to give offerings. Shiloh was the place where the tabernacle was at this particular time in history. And Hannah prayed at the tabernacle to have children. And Eli, the priest, he sees her praying. And as she's praying, her mouth is moving, but no words are coming out. And he thinks that she's drunk. So he says, "Go away, woman." But she explains her situation to Eli. And in the end result, Eli says, "Go in peace, and the Lord grant your petition." And her petition was granted. She did have a child. The name of that child was Samuel. It's the last judge of Israel. This is the introduction to one of the most eventful books of the Bible. A book named after that son, 1 Samuel. And this book covers the transition from the judges to the kings as the ruling bodies within Israel. And today we're going to look in this book and deal with a prevalent theme that can be seen throughout this book. And it's a theme that we can see foreshadowed within Hannah's prayer, which starts chapter 2 of 1 Samuel. So let's turn there. 1 Samuel 2 and verse 1. First Samuel 2 and verse 1. And Hannah prayed and said, "My heart rejoices in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. I smile at my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation. No one is holy like the Lord, for there is none besides you, nor is there any rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly. Let no arrogance come from your mouth. For the Lord is the God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty men are broken, and those who stumbled are girded with strength. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread, and the hungry have ceased to hunger. Even the barren has borne 7, and she who has many children has become feeble. The Lord kills and makes alive. He brings down to the grave, and he brings up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low and lifts up. He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the beggar from the ash heap, to set them among princes and make them inherit the throne of glory. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and he has set the world upon them. He will guard the feet of his saints, but the wicked shall be silent in darkness. For by strength no man shall prevail. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken in pieces. From heaven he will thunder against them. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. So this prayer foreshadows several things. It talks about giving strength, God giving strength to the king. At this time, Israel didn't even have kings. But this book, 1 Samuel, talks about the stories of both the first and second Israelite kings. It also talks about the anointed. This is the Hebrew word Mashiach, which we know better as Messiah. 1 Samuel uses Mashiach more than any other book of the Bible. It uses it 12 times. And it's not referring to Jesus Christ in these cases. It's using to describe both Saul and David as the God-chosen king of Israel. It also talks about these extremes in people's circumstances as part of God's judgment. The bow of the mighty broken versus those who stumbled girded with strength. Even the barren has borne 7, which would have been Hannah. And she contrasts it with those with many children becoming feeble. The poor becoming rich. The low being lifted up. All these things are coming from God. Why does God do this? What is Hannah trying to say in this prayer? All these extremes in circumstances are encapsulated in a theme. And that theme is talked about in verse 3, and it ends in verse 9. So let's read verse 3 again. It says, "Talk no more so very proudly. Let no arrogance come from your mouth. For the Lord is the God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed." Why does God allow these shifts between these kind of extreme circumstances that people have? Pride, and the contrast to that, humility. He's weighing the actions of people. The mighty fall because of pride, and the weak rise due to humility. There is a spiritual nature to success and failure. Success comes from God, a God that looks at our heart. And pride and humility are probably the best measure of how right our heart is. And this begins with the realization of what Hannah says in verse 9. For by strength shall no man prevail. This statement in verse 9 is the title of my message today. By strength shall no man prevail. Understanding this fact, this basic life lesson, is key to success. We will not prevail by our own strength is the starting point to beating pride. Money is said to be the root of all kinds of sin by Paul. But money is only a sin because it affects our heart. Money is a point of pride. It's saying, look what I have accomplished. Look how rich I am. Look how much I have. And almost all sin is connected to pride. So today we're going to look at pride, and from the perspective of probably one of the saddest stories of the Bible, and it's in 1 Samuel, the story of Saul. So the story of Saul begins in chapter 9 of 1 Samuel. And what is he doing at the start of chapter 9? He's looking for some donkeys. It's an interesting place to start the story. A humble beginning for the man who would become king. And he's looking for these donkeys, and he's having a hard time trying to find them. So hard that he ends up going to see a seer, a prophet, to help him find these donkeys. And this prophet that he finds is none other than Samuel. So let's pick up this story in 1 Samuel 9 verse 18. 1 Samuel 9, verse 18. Then Saul drew near to Samuel in the gate and said, "Please tell me, where is the seer's house?" Samuel answered Saul and said, "I am the seer. Go up before me to the high place, for you shall eat with me today. And tomorrow I will let you go, and will tell you all that is in your heart. But as for your donkeys that were lost 3 days ago, do not be anxious about them, for they have been found. And on whom is all the desire of Israel? Is it not on you and on all your father's house?" And Saul answered and said, "Am I not a Benjamite, of the smallest of the tribes of Israel? And my family the least of all the families of the tribe of Benjamin? Why then do you speak like this to me?" This is our introduction to Saul. And this story emphasizes his humility. He has a small view of himself. Samuel calls Saul the desire of Israel. But Saul's response is, "I'm from the smallest tribe and from the least family of this tribe." And he was from the smallest tribe. If you read at the end of Judges, almost all of Benjamin was wiped out at the end of Judges. But so that's what he looked at. But at the beginning of Samuel, it talks about Saul as being handsome and being a head taller than everybody else. But that was not his focus. He didn't view himself that way. Anyways, as you read on in the story, Samuel reveals Saul would be king, and later, lots are chosen to select the king. I'm going to take a quick drink. As we already heard, God had already selected Saul to be king, so this was kind of a formality to reveal who the king would be to the people. And Saul also knows that he's going to be selected as the king as part of this casting of lots. And he hides. And he's selected, and nobody can find him. And then God reveals that he is hiding in the equipment. At first, it doesn't seem as if Saul wanted to be king. He seems fearful of this position that's being thrust on him. He sees himself as being unworthy. And he seems to have a genuine, humble spirit. After this selection of the king, there are rebels that say, "How can this man save us?" And it says that they didn't give him presents, which was a sign that they didn't respect their new king. And what does it say about Paul as a response to these people? It says he held his peace. In the next chapter, Saul, through God, is able to command an army to save the people of Jabesh Gilead and conquers the Ammonites that were threatening that city. And this was a great victory. And after this victory, some encouraged Saul to put these rebels to death. And this is Saul's response. "Not a man shall be put to death this day, for today the Lord has accomplished salvation in Israel." Saul was a humble man, and he exemplifies the qualities we all would want to have in a leader. But after 2 years as king, we begin to see a change in attitude in Saul. And this is not uncommon for somebody in a leadership position to become more prideful. Everybody loves you, everybody's trying to kind of kiss up to you, and it kind of goes to your head. Kind of makes you think, maybe I am something great. It's this whole process of falling prey to what everyone else thinks. And this can really be an entry point to pride. So we're going to look at Saul's first failing in his transition from being humble to prideful in 1 Samuel 13, verse 8. 1 Samuel 13, verse 8. Then he waited 7 days according to the time set by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. So Saul said, "Bring a burnt offering and peace offerings here to me." And he offered the burnt offering. Now it happened, as soon as he had finished presenting the burnt offering, that Samuel came. And Saul went out to meet him, that he might greet him. And Samuel said, "What have you done?" Saul said, "When I saw the people were scattered from me, and that you did not come within the days appointed, and that the Philistines gathered together at Michmash, then I said, the Philistines will now come down on me at Gilgal, and I have not made supplication to the Lord. Therefore I felt compelled and offered a burnt offering." And Samuel said to Saul, "You have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be commander over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." So this is the first mistake recorded about Saul, at least from my perspective, and it had dire consequences. Saul's kingdom would not continue. What was Saul's mistake? He didn't obey God. Only the priests were to offer sacrifices, and he offered a sacrifice in place of the priests. And why did Saul do this? Because of the people. He was worried about what they would think. He was worried that they would scatter. This desire to please others comes from a root of pride. This desire to please others and become popular is a common entry point for pride. So today I'm going to go through 5 different signs of pride, and we need to recognize the signs of pride in order to battle against it. And the first sign of pride is wanting to be popular. Wanting to be popular. This is a lifelong battle to not let people's opinions steer us from what is right. There is something within us that so badly wants to be accepted by others. In middle school, I had 2 sets of friends that I sat with at lunch. They were the funny friends. They were kind of cool. I didn't really hang out with the cool kids. And there were the nerdy friends. And only a certain number of people could sit at the funny table. And there was always a pressure to sit with the funny friends, because it felt like you're a reject when you're sitting with all the nerds. But honestly, I enjoyed both sets of kids, and I enjoyed the conversations just as much on both sides. And it was a little ridiculous that I cared. But I did. It was a point of pride. It is wrong to let my friends be dictated by popular opinion. Times have changed, but this pressure to fit in and be popular has only increased. Technology, social media, allows people to create their own online image. People can share thoughts and feel like they belong within a group without even being there with them. And that can be very intriguing. But it also allows this constant bombardment of social pressures. And this is something we need to manage, because life is more than just pleasing others. Saul made many more mistakes. The second mistake he made was after one of the most miraculous military victories in the Bible. The Israelites are vastly outnumbered by the Philistines. Jonathan and his armor bearer climb up to the Philistines and kill 20 of them, and God causes this great earthquake, and it completely changes the course of the battle. And Israel is just pounding on these Philistines. But then Saul messes up by making an oath. In 1 Samuel 14, verse 24, it says, "And the men of Israel were distressed that day, for Saul had placed the people under oath, saying, 'Cursed is the man who eats any food until evening, before I have taken vengeance on my enemies.' So none of the people tasted food." So oaths weren't prohibited in Israel. Making an oath to seek God's favor is not by itself wrong. But Jesus talks about oaths in the New Testament because people were really misusing oaths in that time. And they weren't following through with their oaths. And he said, just let your yes be your yes and your no but be your no. And I think Saul was misusing oaths right here. And it kind of showed an internal change in Saul, because his oath wasn't focused on God. God wasn't mentioned in his oath at all. The oath was completely focused on himself. He was imposing this fasting role on his army for the purpose for him to take vengeance on his enemies. And this self-focus led to problems. Jonathan, his son, who didn't even know about the oath, ate some honey. And when Jonathan learned about the oath, he criticized his father. He said it was counterproductive. If the soldiers would be eating, they would have more strength and they'd be tearing these Philistines up even more. But the result was that they had to stop the campaign because God was no longer with them because the oath was not fulfilled. So sign of pride number 2, putting our desires before others. Putting our desires before others. Saul's failings continue. Next, he's commanded to utterly destroy the Amalekites. But he doesn't do that. He lets the best of the animals live as well as the king. So let's pick up the story in 1 Samuel 15, verse 10. Now the word of the Lord came to Samuel, saying, I greatly regret that I have set up Saul as king, for he has turned back from following me and has not performed my commandments. And it grieved Samuel, and he cried out to the Lord all night. So when Samuel rose early in the morning to meet Saul, it was told Samuel, saying, Saul went to Carmel, and indeed he set up a monument for himself. And he has gone on around, passed by, and gone down to Gilgal. Then Samuel went to Saul, and Saul said to him, Blessed are you of the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord. But Samuel said, What then is this bleating of the sheep in my ears, and the lowing of the oxen which I hear? So there's several disturbing aspects of Saul if you look closely at this section of Scripture. Saul eventually does lose his sanity, and here we get a taste for how that eventually occurs to him. Because he is losing touch with reality. He's told to conquer the Amalekites, and he has this military victory, which isn't surprising because God was on his side. And what does he do after this victory? He sets up a monument to himself. Just completely bizarre. Remember, by strength shall no man prevail. God was his source of victory, but here we see Saul taking credit. This attitude is why God regretted setting Saul up as king. There was a humility once there, but it had vanished. Saul was a different person. And Saul was commanded to kill everything. And as we know, he left the best of the animals, and he left the king. And the first thing that Saul says, look how great I am at fulfilling the commandment of the Lord. And I can just imagine Samuel at this point, his mouth dropping. It's like someone coming into church and bragging about their righteousness, all the while eating a ham sandwich. Saul's response, are you nuts? What's this bleating of sheep I hear? So the sign of pride number 3, losing touch with reality. Losing touch with reality. Reality is the fact that you are not center of the world. but pride causes us to have this self-centric view of the world. And it's one of the most dangerous parts of pride because it's difficult to change when you start losing touch. As we continue with the story, Saul becomes troubled. He's bothered by a distressing spirit from God. In 1 Samuel, it actually talks about spirits a lot more than probably any other book in the Old Testament. We don't know what this spirit was, whether it was an evil spirit or something else. But he's bothered by this spirit. And as around this time, God chooses David to be the next king. And again, like Saul, David is anointed by Samuel. And we can see that God is working with David very early on because he's brought to the palace to play his harp to soothe Saul from this distressing spirit. All the while, the Philistines and Israelites are still at war. And a champion comes to the scene from the side of the Philistines known as Goliath. And he calls Israel out to bring a warrior to fight him. We'll be your slaves if he wins, and you'll be our slaves if I win. And it would have made sense for Saul to be that warrior, because after all, he was a good warrior. He was ahead over everyone else. But we all know that David fights him and defeats him. And Saul is happy with David at first, but this happiness quickly sours. Let's turn to 1 Samuel 18, verse 6. Now it happened, as they were coming home, when David was returning from the slaughter of the Philistine, that the women had come out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments. So the women sang as they danced and said, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. Then Saul was very angry, and the saying displeased him. And he said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed only thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom? So Saul eyed David from that day forward. And it happened on the next day that the distressing spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied inside the house. So David played music with his hand as at other times. But there was a spear in Saul's hand. And Saul cast the spear, for he said, I will pin David to the wall. But David escaped his presence twice. So this is kind of a predictable course of events when you've got a prideful king like Saul. David was a hero. He had beat Goliath, and everybody loved him. Even today, it's a great story, the story of David and Goliath. I asked my two younger daughters, what's their favorite story in the Bible? And the first thing that came out of their mouth, David and Goliath. And this love for David makes Saul angry. People view David better than me. And it all kind of goes back to that wanting to be popular thing. He wanted to be most popular. He was the king. He wanted to be loved by everybody more than anybody else. And this led to sign of pride number 4, jealousy. Jealousy. Comparing our successes with others leads us down a bad path. Jealousy forms. and we start asking questions like, why can't I be like them? And I want what they have. And this breeds sin. It breeds covetousness. And it led Saul to try to murder David. And this is sign of pride number 5. Hatred. Hatred. Saul had a murderous hatred for David. And this hatred would consume Saul for the rest of his life. Saul's family loved David. His daughter, Michal, adored David and eventually married him. His son, Jonathan, was probably David's most loyal friend. But this didn't change Saul. His hatred for David was unrelenting. And there is a connection between hatred and pride, because hatred comes from our own self-centered attitude. Someone has wronged me, and many times this is justified, that somebody really has wronged you. And hatred is that response to being wronged. But it begins in our heart, and it begins with our pride. Saul's story is a great tragedy. It's about a humble man that becomes proud, hateful, and murderous. Pride leads to him almost murdering his son, and it does lead him to murdering 85 of the priests. And God was no longer with him. And he would eventually die on the battlefield at the hand of his most bitter enemies, the Philistines. But his story is a teaching moment about what pride does and what pride is. These signs of pride come within us. They come from our heart, and they come from our mind. And they can be seen in our actions, but they come from within us. So now I'm going to move on to 3 lessons for overcoming pride. Overcoming pride, lesson number 1. Recognize pride and repent. Recognize pride and repent. This seems simple, recognizing the signs, and all we have to do is change our attitudes. But it's hard. Saul actually tried to do this. There are a few times that his pride was revealed to him and he repented. But he could never fully remove the pride from him. It always came back. Recognizing and removing pride is probably one of the hardest parts of this life. It's a battle that begins with us as children, and it ends when we die. We can never leave our guard down against pride. And that's why it's so important to know the signs of pride and address them early when we start to see them. We need to step back and say, I know where this comes from, and I am not going to let it continue. Now I'm going to transition to the story of David. David follows a similar yet different path from Saul. David also had humble beginnings. He made mistakes, but the difference between him and Paul was that he never let pride take hold. He is called a man after God's own heart. And this can be attributed by his ability to stay humble despite the many pressures that he was facing. He felt many of the same pressures that Saul did because he was also king. David's life is filled with lessons about how we can overcome pride. And I can't go through all of them today. I'm going to just stay in 1 Samuel and talk through some of the lessons that we can find there. So next, let's turn to 1 Samuel 24, verse 1. For Samuel 24, verse 1. Now it happened when Saul had returned from following the Philistines that it was told him, saying, "Take note, David is in the wilderness of En-gedi." Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel and went to seek David and his men on the rocks of the wild goats. So he came to the sheepfolds by the road, where there was a cave, and Saul went in to attend to his needs. He was going to the bathroom. And David and his men were staying in the recesses of that cave. Then the men of David said to him, "This is the day of which the Lord said to you, Behold, I will deliver your enemy into your hand, that you may do to him as it seems good to you." And David arose and secretly cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Now it happened afterward that David's heart troubled him because he had cut Saul's robe. And he said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, seeing he is the anointed." Again, the anointed is the Mashiach of the Lord. So David restrained his servants with these words and did not allow them to rise against Saul. And Saul got up from the cave and went on his way. Saul's hatred for David was unwarranted. David was extremely loyal to Saul despite all of the things that Saul was doing to David. And this was David's opportunity to get vengeance. So it seems reasonable, with Saul being so unrelenting, that David would take this opportunity. But vengeance is a close relative of hatred. Both come from pride, focusing on ourself, our situation, our feelings. And David did not give in to vengeance or hatred. And Saul still didn't relent, even after this. So it was revealed to Saul that David had spared him, but Saul was still after him. And again, David gets another opportunity to take vengeance on Saul. And it says in 1 Samuel 26, verse 10, it says, David says, "As the Lord lives, the Lord shall strike him, or his day shall come to die, or he shall go out to battle and perish. The Lord forbid that I should stretch out my hand against the Lord's anointed. But please take now the spear and the jug that are by his head, and let us go." So this leads to lesson number 2 of overcoming pride. And this lesson is very similar to the title of my message. We do not overcome our enemies by our strength, but by God's. We do not overcome our enemies by our strength, but by God's. And in these cases, it meant restraint. But in the next case that we're going to turn to, it meant action. So let's turn to 1 Samuel 17, verse 26. Been bouncing around this one all day. This is David and Goliath. And David had just got to the camp, and he's asking questions about what's going on. 1 Samuel 17, verse 26. Then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is the uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him in this manner, saying, So shall it be done for the man who kills him. Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men. And Eliab's anger was aroused against David, and he said, Why did you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. And David said, What have I done now? Is there not a cause? This is two brothers getting back and forth at each other. Then he turned from him toward another and said the same thing, and the people answered him as the first ones did. So Eliab, David's brother, was angered at David for asking these questions about the reward for killing the giant, Goliath. Why was Eliab angry? He said, I know your pride. Eliab thought David as prideful. And this is understandable because David was very confident. He was confident here. He was confident when he slew Goliath. And he was confident pretty much his whole life. And this type of confidence can seem very prideful. But where was David's confidence founded? Let's drop down to verse 45. Then David said to the Philistine, this is right at the start of the battle, You come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. So it was, when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to David, that David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. Then David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword, and drew it out of its sheath, and killed him, and cut off his head with it. David was very confident. He was confident in his words, and he was confident in his actions when he attacked Goliath. Was this confidence in his own strength, though? God was on his side, and he knew it. This fueled his confidence. You come at me with weapons, but I come at you in the name of the Lord. Remember, by strength shall no man prevail. How do we prevail? Through God. We can be confident and should be confident. Not because we are great, but we serve a God who is great and mighty, a God who will not fail us if we stay connected to him. In the New Testament, Jesus stresses that we should not worry. It says that God knows our struggles. He knows even the number of the hairs on our head. In this same line, Jesus talks about the lilies being more beautiful than even the rich. Even the Solomon isn't arrayed like one of these. This is not because of anything that the lilies did. This is because God made them special. Through his strength, and only his strength, we will prevail. Overcoming pride, lesson number 3. And it's a little longer because I didn't find a way to kind of amalgamate it. Being confident doesn't mean we are proud. We should be confident because we serve a mighty God who will intervene on our behalf. Being confident doesn't mean we are proud. We should be confident because we serve a mighty God who will intervene on our behalf. We all have Goliaths, problems and challenges that seem insurmountable. At work, especially when I was just starting as an entry-level employee, there were tasks given to me that I just wasn't sure how I was going to solve them. But in the end, God made it all work out. I work in software, which is code, and finding bugs in code is like sometimes finding a needle in a haystack. But God always seemed to help me find that needle. I could be confident, and I can be confident, not because I'm special, but because God is with me. Anxiety and worry, the world is filled with these. Because the world thinks that their success is the result of their own accomplishment. It should not be so with us. We strive to do and accomplish, but we look to God to prevail. And it's comforting to know that we are not alone in victory because God is working with us. In looking at Saul's example, we can see a natural progression of pride. It begins with doing things to please others, progresses to putting our desires before others and God. It further progresses to us losing touch with reality, and lastly devolves into jealousy and hatred. As seen with Saul, even the humblest of people can succumb to pride if they are not constantly aware and watchful of it entering into their lives. But how should we overcome pride? First, we must realize fighting pride is a constant battle. In childhood, adulthood, old age, it is a battle that will persist through good times and bad. And when it pops into our life, we must recognize its signs and change rather than let it fester and grow. In this life, we have and will have enemies. We will not prevail against them by our own actions, but through God. Sometimes this means turning the other cheek, but other times this is looking to God to defeat the Goliath that is before us. In both cases, it comes with a selfless attitude of wanting to do right before God. He is on our side and wants us to succeed. We don't need to worry, because through him, we can be confident. We will prevail. We will have victory, but that victory will come from God. Remember Hannah's prayer, "By strength shall no man prevail."